So my name is Cecilia Herles, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Institute for Women's Studies at the University of Georgia in the United States. And I'm delighted to join you to share a little bit about my presentation on food. The title of my talk today is Feminist Frameworks for Engaging in the Pursuit of Food Justice, Roots of Legacies of Val Plumwood and Grace Lee Boggs. This is based on the work that I did. My background is in philosophy, so my PowerPoint will reflect, I think, a lack of visual, but hopefully I will kind of explain some of the ecological feminist framework theoretically that I'm utilizing as I investigate food waste and food insecurity in our food systems, both globally and locally. And that's reflected in the teaching that I do at the University of Georgia. I teach service learning courses in women's studies. So how can teachers and administrators promote food justice, decolonize practices and teaching, and encourage civic engagement and community building? I turn to an ecological feminist framework inspired by Val Plumwood, and I look at the pedagogical and administrative strategies for curriculum that I glean through teaching women's studies service learning courses on food studies. These classes are connected to student-led organizations, including a community garden and a campus kitchen organization addressing food waste and food insecurity. This approach to teaching and learning in women's studies faces challenges, however. It has potential, I think, to sustain reciprocal learning about the violence of erasure in food politics, decolonize teaching, and hopefully promote epistemic and social justice through community building. So my name is Cecilia Herles, as I mentioned. I have Irish and Chinese grandparents who worked the land growing food, and they often suffered with food insecurity themselves. Food shapes my memories and my notions of identity, and I often wonder, how can I honor the sacrifice and the work of my ancestors by being socially responsible and engaging in food activism while the planet is in crisis and food waste and food insecurity are on the rise? The complex socio-political, corporeal, and material aspects of food relationships are relevant for theoretical and activist feminist practices. So I looked at feminist frameworks for engaging in the pursuit of food justice. I looked to the legacies of Val Plumwood and Grace Lee Boggs and their life work and the life work of Wangari Maathai and others. They have influenced how I teach and my research. What a waste, the mindset of careless abandon in food. Food waste symbolizes the lack of value attached to the labor of those producing and preparing food. This unsustainable practice relates to the construction of other through gender, race, class, and sexuality, and so on. And this can't be ignored in the movements that are working towards food justice. A third of the world's food, which is approximately 1.3 billion tons of food, goes to waste, and the wasted food contributes a great deal to global greenhouse gas emissions. When food goes to a landfill, methane emissions are emitted, and methane gas is the second most prevalent greenhouse gas emitted in the United States. The waste of food is often connected to the radical separation of the devalued other, and that is reflected in anti-immigration laws and the ways in which those who work in food production are devalued as the other. US farms, for example, have faced anti-immigration laws that create shortages in the labor force and results in thousands of acres of crops rotting in fields. These anti-immigration policies don't account for all the waste. Sometimes it's a matter of the consumer tossing food away unnecessarily, and this illustrates what I call the mindset of careless abandon. Careless abandon is prominent in many people's relationships with food and comes from a place of privilege and a sense of disconnection, even separation from food production. For example, the mindset of careless abandon can be seen in consumer preferences for perfect fruit. The mindset of careless abandon behind consumers is also involved in throwing of leftovers. One of the most common types of food to be discarded is seafood. and many other forms. The mindset of careless abandon is also found in wasteful packaging and careless procedures, for example, at places like Walmart that are churning out rotting food stacked on pallets. Tracy McMillan's book, The American Way of Eating, illustrates the patterns of corporations such as Walmart that control most of or much of the global food production that is contributing to this waste of food in an economy of abundance and deprivation that creates insecurity and malnutrition around the world. Food waste is woven into the current infrastructure of the food production, transportation systems in the US. Issues often arise with the distances that are covered to transport food, the global shift to cash mediated monoculture has caused more global footprint, with its emphasis on exporting luxury cash crops. The fuel then is used to export these crops around the world, which offers economically advantageous consumers a form of food colonialism and adventurism in having exotic food at any time. However, there is a negative impact on the regions that are produced crops, as well as a significant link to food insecurity in these regions as well. So therefore, in considering alternative food systems, I turn to the legacies of Val Plumwood and Grace Lee Boggs. First, I'll speak to Val Plumwood's work. As a Chinese American who lived a very long life from 1915 to 2015, she left an important legacy behind for feminist activism. Although she did not see the COVID pandemic, her thoughts on persistent problems leading up to are relevant more than ever now. And this pandemic, of course, has only further exposed the vast health and wealth disparities. The pandemic has fueled not only hateful racist rhetoric, but of course contributed to rising acts of violence. And Boggs referred to the specific ways in which her positionality as an Asian woman left her subject to job discrimination and overall suspicion, particularly in her involvement in Black Power movements. So Grace Lee Boggs was a pragmatic philosopher who embraced a food revolution that was nuanced to meet the needs of all, particularly those in the margins. The pandemic has illustrated the ways in which food systems are vulnerable, and those in the margins are particularly vulnerable due to factors such as environmental degradation, climate change, biodiversity loss of habitat for non-human species, and lack of transportation, housing, and overall protections for the health of essential workers and food. This vulnerability is evident to me in my local area in Georgia, where undocumented workers crammed in poultry slaughterhouses had little or no access to health care, no access to sick leave, and Gainesville, Georgia became one of the first hotspots of COVID cases in the United States. So how do feminist activists sustain themselves and their community? For Boggs, she saw the possibilities of urban farming and food justice. She saw a paradigm shift in the quiet revolution, preparing Detroiters in Michigan to meet today's growing crises of global warming and spiraling food prices. A key part of this organization was recognizing the importance of knowing history and creating multi-generational connections and intergenerational knowledge production. Grace Lee Boggs and her partner James Boggs were well-versed in the art of community organizing, and they believed that revolutionary theory flowed to revolutionary practice and back again. Like many feminist activist scholars such as Bell Hooks, Val Plumwood, and Vandana Shiva, they reject any notion of separation between theory and activism, and they highly value the relationship between both theory and practice. A central theme of Grace Lee Boggs' work was her response to crisis and how she viewed crisis as illustrating the connection between necessity and invention. Boggs stated that, quote, every crisis, actual or impending, needs to be viewed as an opportunity to bring about profound changes in our society, end quote. And that means creating images and stories of the future that help us to imagine and create alternatives to the existing systems. Necessity and freedom coming together in Detroit's food landscape involves taking responsibility for growing food locally and rebuilding the place in the community from the ground up so that invention transforms the food landscape in Detroit, Michigan. Much of the Detroit summer program focuses on the food landscape and structures with planting community gardens, rehabbing houses and painting murals. As Boggs recalls, quote, "In Detroit summer, we combine physical forms of work with workshops and intergenerational dialogues on how to rebuild Detroit, thus further expanding minds and imaginations of the young, the old, and in between," end quote. More recently, through Detroit's Freedom grower, former Black Panther Wayne Curtis and Myrtle Thompson repurposed a vacant lot with the motto, quote, "Grow a garden, grow a community," end quote. While there are countless tangible benefits to growing food in these abandoned spaces, these practices are in tune with a transformative way of thinking. So rejecting dualistic thinking and embracing interconnections are part of what I take in my classes. These approaches to growing food encourage apathy and appreciation for humanity and building community with others and embracing the interconnection with the land and natural processes in urban and rural spaces. The aspects of food revolution illustrate a rejection of dualistic thinking in food. Ecological feminist philosopher and activist Val Plumwood states that a dualism results from a certain kind of denied dependency on a subordinated other, in which, quote, "Power construes and constructs difference in terms of an inferior and alien realm," end quote. I argue that dualistic thought is related to how both food waste and food insecurity simultaneously plague food systems. Much of the essential work of food is overlooked, and unprotected workers suffer in the background in dangerous working conditions where pay is little, not at all, not to mention hazardous crossing into the US border to do that work. In Detroit summer, Grace Lee Boggs understood the importance of intergenerational knowledge shared in urban farming, illustrating a rejection of dualistic thinking about a supposed radical separation between nature and culture, and a supposed radical separation of generations old and young. Fueling these intergenerational connections is more important now as we're faced with aging farmers and a rising number of aging who face food insecurity. Oftentimes, seniors may be prone to food insecurity for issues of mobility, health, transportation, or isolation. So the practice of multiple generations sharing housing or meals, connecting through food production and consumption, are valued practices that can't fall by the wayside and be forced out by the commodification of food. In addition to intergenerational knowledge sharing, for folks in the US, it's important to look to other places and practices in order to learn how they are connecting with the land in more sustainable ways and in dealing with environmental crises. So I'll just mention a couple. One is who I take a shining global leader of women's empowerment and sustainability, and that was Wangari Maathai, the Kenyan leader of the Green Belt movement, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004 for her work in sustainable development, democracy, and in peace. So Wangari Maathai, through the Green Belt movement, empowered women, sharing knowledge of tree planting while also they earned income by planting these trees. These green belts of trees established windbreaks, conserved soil, made landscape beautiful, provided habitats for non-humans, and in doing so, grounded ecologically sustainable development. And tree planting, of course, now is very particularly important in urban spaces to reduce the concrete impact in heat and air pollution. Another person that I'll briefly mention is the work of Vandana Shiva. She is an ecofeminist scientist from India who has emphasized the need for food sovereignty and seed sovereignty, and exposed how farmers, particularly women who have been saving seeds for generations, need to retain this power of passing on seeds. Shiva argues that Monsanto's planting of seeds have focused on profits that ignores the risks and includes the reduction of biodiversity. She notes how, quote, life itself is being colonized, end quote. Shiva practices seed saving, food sovereignty, in contrast to the maldevelopment found in the latest colonialism of multinational corporation control over food that has weakened natural resources, threatening more food insecurity and loss of democracy. One of the pressing environmental social justice issues Shiva and other ecofeminists call attention to is also the chemical pesticide usage in agricultural production. This shift to chemical pesticide usage has actually been linked to the loss of pollinators, such as bees, and it poses a direct threat to global food security. So I'll skip ahead for time's sake, just to talk very briefly about where I see the futures of sustainable feminist activism. I'm inspired by Grace Lee Boggs because she had always exuded an optimism in facing crises. And I think that Boggs would be delighted to look at the tech-savvy ways for knowledge sharing, such as foraging on TikTok, a post by Alexis Nicole Nelson. There's also some great interactive mapping of fruit trees planted in Atlanta, which is close to where I live in Georgia. And these innovative platforms of knowledge sharing are done by organizations such as Concrete Jungle and Falling Fruit that can help folks access food in urban spaces and illustrate the potential for participatory action connected to food systems in urban spaces. As I mentioned, I teach service learning classes, and we've connected with Concrete Jungle. We've also worked closely with other student organizations, such as U Garden, which is a student-run farm at the University of Georgia. And they grow food that then is used through campus kitchens to reduce food insecurity and food waste. So they're collaborating student-led organizations, and campus kitchens takes food that would otherwise go wasted, makes them into meals, and delivers them out into the community. My class has participated closely with Campus Kitchen, U Garden, and Concrete Jungle, and they've also worked with a community partner, Athens Community Council on Aging, working with the seniors in their garden. And I think that these are just some illustrations for those who are teaching to think about ways to make local food production be informed by a transformation of values. This can open up the possibilities to think about how productivity can be reimagined to reject material overabundance for the few, and instead create the world anew with value for the finite natural resources that we ought to cherish and protect. In closing, live simply so that others may simply live was my first philosophy paper, and that I wrote back in the 1990s, but I can't come back to it now without thinking that maybe there was something to that. Of course, in doing this work of feminist activism around sustainability, there can be burnout and despair, but I think that sustainable feminist activism means not only meeting the 4 pillars of sustainability, but also using a feminist toolkit promoted by Sarah Ahmed's work so that burnout and despair are not the ending point of the process. I hope that myself and my students are able to resist the burnout and despair through these service learning opportunities, and to recognize the reciprocal relationships that youth and the aging can have with regards to food production, food consumption, growing food, and sharing food. Thanks so much for this time.